Okay, good morning, everybody. This is the Transmission Corridors Work Group meeting number 1. A couple of quick notes and reminders before I turn it over to Kathleen to open the meeting. This meeting is being live streamed to YouTube. And as a part of that, the public is invited to join this Zoom. However, if you are a public and you're on this Zoom meeting, the public comment is not going to be till 3:40 p.m. today. So if you're on the Zoom meeting and you're willing to go to the live stream, it helps simplify the meeting facilitation for me as I'm able to manage the participant list a little easier. So if you're a member of the public and you're willing to pop over to the live stream, that would be great. You can join the live stream at www.rawstrategic.com/live stream. And then you can rejoin this Zoom meeting to provide public comment at 3:40. So again, this meeting is being live streamed. And there are folks from the public on the Zoom now. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to you, Kathleen. Kathleen, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kathleen Drew. I'm chair of the Washington Energy Facility Site Evaluation Council. Welcome to the first meeting of the Transmission Corridors Work Group. As you know, the work group was established as part of the Clean Energy Transformation Act, and the members of this group represent entities that were named in the statute. I'll talk a little bit more about the FSEC role and some other welcome remarks, but first I'd like to introduce Anna Lissing, who is the governor's policy advisor for energy. Anna?
Thanks, Kathleen, and thank you, everyone. And since it's being recorded, I'll say for the record, my last name is pronounced Leasing. No problem. And so I just wanted to make this pretty brief, but wanted to thank everyone for coming together. I know everyone has very busy schedules, but this is a really important conversation and also a problem set that we need to put our collective thought towards solving, where we have really ambitious goals that are necessary given the extent of climate change impacts that we're already living through with our wildfires and our droughts. And on the other parts of the country, we're seeing continuous floods, and with our latest heat dome, you could visibly see our snowpack melting within days. So this is really important for us to be able to get to a place where we are into 100% clean energy, and we can't do that without transmission. Transmission is going to be the backbone to ensuring that we have a reliable and resilient electricity grid. And so I'm really excited to see this work get underway and make sure that we are on a path to be able to achieve our commitments with CETA. I will just add that this is not entirely on the shoulders of everyone here. We're also working to make sure that we have a strong federal partnership to make sure that we have the resources needed, not only just to build out in-state transmission, but also new regional transmission, which is going to be really critical for having a more reliable and diverse resource mix across the entire western half of the U.S. A couple of notes on that. We're through the bipartisan infrastructure framework. We've have been working to ensure that we can continue getting resources to build out new transmissions. So there's a DOE revolving loan fund that was included in that bill language, as well as authority for FERC to be able to kind of manage the multi-state transmission process a little bit better to ensure that we actually get new transmission built out to the West Coast. We also have been pushed pretty hard for through the budget reconciliation process to increase the amount of funding in the DOE revolving loan fund. That would be a new program to stand up new transmission projects and be able to have those be a little bit more financially feasible. So these are areas that we're committed to continue pursuing. It's finding areas where there's collective pain point, but not necessarily the in-state resources to tackle it. And so how can we bring in our federal partners and our regional partners to be able to kind of accelerate our build out for a new transmission, and where does it make sense in our state? So I'm looking forward to this working group being able to inform all those pieces.
Thank you, Anna Leasing with the governor's office. As I said, I'll tell you a little bit about FSEC because we're somewhat of a little known agency, but we were directed to lead this effort because of our siting and permitting expertise. FSEC was established in 1970 as one-stop permitting for thermal power plants. We cite nuclear power facilities that produce and sell electricity, non-hydro, non-nuclear thermal power plants of 350 megawatts or more, alternative energy resources, which includes wind, solar, geothermal, wave, tidal, landfill gas, biomass. And those are all any size, but they have to opt into the FSEC process. Transmission lines of 115 plus kilovolts, again, they have to opt into the FSEC process. Some pipelines and some refineries and storage facilities. So that's enough about FSEC for now. Excuse me. Part of achieving our clean energy goals is making sure we have enough transmission to move the electricity from where it's generated to where it's used. But that's neither straightforward nor easy. Transmission is not governed by the state or even one entity. Around this virtual table are people who make decisions and policies that impact siting transmission projects and the land, people, and resources that can be affected by those projects. But specifically, I want to acknowledge that there are two sectors that have not yet been added to this group because they weren't listed in the legislation, and that's labor and the renewable energy industry. As you can understand, both sectors will contribute greatly to our collective understanding of transmission issues. So as the convener of this group, I will be inviting each sector to identify a representative to join us at this table going forward. I also want to acknowledge that there are other organizations and individuals not on the work group who may want to submit information, ideas, and public comment. And we welcome everybody's participation, and you can do that through the website, or at each meeting, we will include a time at the end of our meeting to hear from you if you would like to make a public statement. Finally, I want to introduce Joe Wood, who will be your main point of contact, and he is a siting specialist with FSEC. Many of you, in fact, probably all of you, have spoken to him already. He is the project manager for this work group, and also Stu Henderson is supporting our work, and he is a senior policy analyst at FSEC. I hope that through our work during this next year, we can identify the needs, challenges, opportunities, and the pathways to the future that will help us achieve our clean energy goals. Thank you so much for putting your time and energy to participating, and let's get started.
Great. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Anna. Good morning. My name is Rob Willis. I go by he, him pronouns. I'm a principal at Ross Strategic, and I'm joined on this call by my colleagues, Susan, Michaela, and Lauren. And we are the contractor facilitator team supporting this effort. Ross Strategic is a small consulting firm with its main offices in Seattle. We primarily do meeting facilitation, strategic planning, and program evaluation for local, state, and federal governments, as well as private foundations. I've been at Ross for 20 years, and I'm thrilled to be supporting Kathleen, FSEC, and the Transportation Working Group. I'm going to ask that my team briefly flip on their video and introduce themselves, just so you can see and hear their voices, because you're going to be hearing from and seeing them a lot over the next 9 months. So Susan, you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Sure thing, Rob. Good morning. I am Susan Heyman. I am a senior associate at Ross Strategic and will be co-facilitating this group with Rob. Really happy to be here.
Thank you, Susan. Lauren?
Good morning, everyone. Lauren Dennis, Ross Strategic. Also part of this team, very happy to join the rest of the bench here, and looking forward to supporting this group.
Thank you, Lauren. Michaela?
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Michaela Unda, also with Ross Strategic, a research associate there, and I will be supporting this project. I'm excited to kick things off today. Back over to you, Rob.
Great. Thank you, Michaela. Okay, so we got to get a lot of little stuff out of the way here, so I'm going to try to do that here as efficiently as possible. The first thing is I want to recognize that many of us are working from locations that are not our primary workplaces or offices like we have been for the last 17 or 18 months, and that increases the likelihood of disruptions, interruptions, basically any form of an option, and that's okay. No big deal. I'm a proud parent of a Great Dane, and should anyone dare to come on my porch during this meeting, I'm going to have to put my phone on mute momentarily. I also want to recognize that a full day's meeting on Zoom can be very taxing. And so we're going to have breaks throughout the day, including an extra long break in the middle of the day to allow folks to recharge, grab some lunch, catch up with work email, step away from the screen. But if at any time you need to step away, please just make sure that you're on mute and your video's off. And if you wanted to shoot me a quick note just to let me know, that would be okay as well. So as you know, we're using Zoom today, and I want to spend a few minutes talking about the Zoom interface, the features and how we plan to use it. So the first and most important is the mute and unmute. That is that button on the bottom left-hand corner of your Zoom interface. It looks like the old-time microphone there. When you press that button, there's a red line through it that indicates that your line's on mute. The button to the right of that is the video button. If you're willing, able, and comfortable, I ask that you keep your video on. It helps me as the facilitator manage the meeting. I can see your faces. I can try to establish some sense of body language and how things are sitting. And I know that as a participant, it also enhances the meeting experience. So if you're willing to leave your video on during this meeting, I would appreciate that very much. The chat feature, which is the little comment bubble button, we have that enabled, fully enabled. Please feel free to use the chat to submit questions during presentations, comments and thoughts you have during discussions, or send me or my staff direct messages if there's anything we can do to support your participation. My colleague Susan, you can find her in the chat list. She's the person who we've identified as the direct support person today. So if there's something that's happening on Zoom or anything that we can do, please shoot Susan a chat message. And then the last thing I want to talk about Zoom here is I want to talk about the raise hand feature, because that's how, as a facilitator, I'm going to be queuing folks up for conversation. And the best way that I know how to use raise hand is to use a keyboard shortcut. You can also find it by hitting the reactions button and hitting raise hand. But if you hit Alt-Y, that will raise your hand, and Alt-Y will lower your hand. So folks, don't mind practicing really quickly just to make sure that we get that Alt-Y to raise your hand. Thank you, Clint. Thank you, Stu. You guys go. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Brendan. Perfect. So Alt-Y toggles. Thank you, Lauren. Vladimir, thank you. That toggles your raise hand up and down. Normally at this part of the meeting is when I would go over participant expectations and ground rules for the meetings and how we operate. For the purposes of today's meeting and meetings going forward, we've embedded those ground rules in the charter. So we're going to talk about the big picture ground rules and the specifics about how this group operate during our charter discussion. The main takeaway for now is that we're limiting comments and participation during the main part of the meeting to the TCWG members and their alternates and their staff. And we have a time set aside specifically for the public at 3:40 in the afternoon. All right. I promise I got just about 2 more things to say, and then I'll be done talking here. So I want to talk very quickly about what we have planned for the day. And if you could advance it to the next slide, please. This meeting has 3 parts to it. The first part of the meeting and the balance of the morning, we're going to spend time getting to know one another a little bit and developing a shared understanding of what our work is. We have a big block of time to do that, about 2 hours and 45 minutes there in case we need it. And then I'll be looking to, if we need to take a quick break during that, we'll find a time to do that. Once we power through that, we're going to take, like I mentioned, a longish break, a 90-minute break, and come back and move into the next part of the meeting, which we're just calling level setting. In preparing for this meeting, Kathleen and her staff thought it would be really valuable to make space for the entire group to learn about the Washington energy strategy, because it's a key driver for the work of this group. We thought it would be really important to learn about transmission and how it works in Washington State, and then to be clear about the transmission siting process. The key to this part of the meeting is to make sure that you ask questions, and then when you think you don't have any more questions, you ask more questions, because the work of this group is going to have to square with and build from the information that's in that energy strategy, in the transmission system, and in the siting process. So we have to have a really good understanding, solid understanding of how those things work together. And so following another break, we're going to reconvene and then have a highly participatory session when you as a work group member are going to be asked to articulate the information you think you need and the questions we seek to answer as a working group. We're then going to have time for public comment, and then we're going to wrap up. Last note here, and then we're going to move to introductions. Again, this meeting is being live streamed on YouTube. The public is invited to join this Zoom meeting, but if you're just going to be listening into this meeting, because we're not allowing public to participate until 3:40, you should feel free to pop over to the live stream. It's more helpful. It's easier for me to manage the group with a smaller participant list. You can go to the live stream by going to www.rawstrategic.com/livestream, and then you're welcome to join the Zoom meeting again at 3:40 to provide public comment. Okay, so that's it. Kathleen, anything else on endless updates and introductions there before we move to where we get to hear from the members about themselves?
I should have had you go first, and then I could have followed your example of asking Joe to appear before us briefly and say hi, as well as Stu. So, Joe.
There you are, Joe.
Everybody. Thanks for taking time to join us today. And I've had the pleasure of speaking with, I think, almost every one of you, and just really look forward to continuing the conversation and learning. Thanks again.
And Stu, are you there?
Yep, Stu Henderson, Senior Policy Advisor here at FSEC. Yeah, just so grateful to all of everyone for coming here, and looking forward to your thoughts and ideas and seeing what we can learn together here. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Rob?
Fabulous. Thank you. Okay, so we're now going to do introductions. And so as part of the meeting prep packet that you received, we asked folks to provide some bios. So you will have that as a persistent resource for yourself. But what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to walk through. I'm going to ask that I'm going to call on an organization, and then I'm going to ask that a designated member introduce themselves first if they're on, to describe the organization and agency's interest in transmission siting, and then describe why the work of the working group is important to you as an individual. And then I'm going to ask an alternate, if the alternate is on the call. No need to answer the first question there about organization or agency interest, but if you could speak to why it's important to you, that would be great. So I'm going to start, and I'm going to start with Commerce. Glenn.
Good morning. I'm Glenn Blackman. I manage the Energy Policy Office at the Department of Commerce, and I'm going to be presenting later on the agenda on the state energy strategy. The Department of Commerce is a very broad-based, multi-program agency that affects communities in many different ways and looks to strengthen communities. So as an energy policy guy, I have a lot of interest in ensuring that we have adequate and robust transmission system to deliver renewable electricity to the people of our state. But on behalf of the Department of Commerce, I also need to keep in mind a lot of other interests too, that individual communities that might be affected by transmission facilities would bring to the table. So that can include, growth management issues. A lot of other community values need to go into our discussion of transmission issues. So the transmission corridor work group is important for me, again, primarily because it's this key catalyst for increasing the amount of renewable energy that we have available to us so that we can meet our state's energy and climate objectives. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Glenn. And the alternate for Commerce who's not here is Michael Furs. Next, I'm going to come to Elizabeth with the UTC, and then after that, I'm going to come to the Department of Ecology. Elizabeth, do you mind quickly introducing yourself?
Good morning. I'm Elizabeth O'Connell. I'm a regulatory analyst with the Utilities and Transportation Commission. The Utilities and Transportation Commission is a regulatory agency in charge of economic regulation of investor-owned utilities in the state of Washington. And we regularly see filings from companies with a lot of transmission assets, and that's what we regularly deal with. I think the transmission corridor work is really important for our agency because we're all together in this effort of implementing all the regulatory measures to make the CETA law a reality in our state. So I think this is a really good segue to make that happen. So I'm very excited to be part of this process.
Great. And you go by Elizabeth?
I do. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Elizabeth. Perfect. Next, I'm going to come to Department of Ecology, and then after that, Fish and Wildlife. So I'm going to go to Brendan and then Diane. Brendan?
Hi, thank you. I'm Brendan McFarland with the Department of Ecology. I manage the environmental review section. That includes statewide rules for the State Environmental Policy Act, or SEPA, which touches an awful lot of other agencies, as well as sometimes involved in the project review when we are SEPA lead agency. We provide training and assistance on that statewide. My section also includes Clean Water Act, Section 401 water quality certifications, touches a lot of linear projects, both policy and project review for that. This is particularly interesting work, not just for Washington's future clean energy goals and economy, but also Department of Ecology is involved with leading a clean energy siting study that's on a pretty rapid timeline, and we're interested with intersections with other clean energy work. I'm happy to be here.
Great, Brendan, thank you. Diane, as the alternate, please.
Yes, hello, I'm Diane Buterak with Ecology. I'm an environmental planner, and I work with Brendan on many of the things he already talked about. I am the project manager for the low carbon energy project siting study that he mentioned. And again, we're very interested to see how this is intersecting and making sure that we have the full picture as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to come to Ben at Fish and Wildlife, and then I'm going to Department of Natural Resources. Ben, please.
Hey everybody, good morning. It's nice to see so many familiar faces. My name is Ben Blank. I'm with Fish and Wildlife, and I'm the energy section manager there. So my team works on FERC licensing and implementation, and it also is involved in the siting and working on projects related to solar and wind. And one of the things that we're kind of most interested in with this project or with this work group is in the siting of the transmission lines, making sure that we're considering habitat and species that might use the locations of those lines, which is similar to our thoughts around the project specific, not just the transmission lines. But anyway, so I'll probably be echoing myself on that throughout this time. Thanks.
Great. Great. Thank you, Ben. And the alternate for Fish and Wildlife is Michael Garrity. Just so you guys start practicing hearing those names. I'm going to come to DNR next, and then I'm going to transportation. Lauren, please.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Glad to be here. Good to see a few people that I know. Lauren Torgerson, I'm with DNR. I'm the strategic advisor for wildfire and forest health issues. Prior to that, I was a regional manager for DNR in our eastern portion of the state. Our interest here really obviously is around wildfire. There are some other issues around land management that I'll be coordinating with some of our folks in our uplands programs, but for us, it's particularly of interest around hazards from wildfire and how we potentially site lines to improve that over time as climate becomes more and more of an issue, particularly on the west side of the state, and how can we plan for that going forward. Recently, we've had a work group as well related to electric utility and wildfire prevention, and we're going to kick off another group here fairly shortly that's going to also be taking a look at that in terms of long-term effects of wildfire hazards and their integration with transmission. So glad to be here. Looking forward to it.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. And the alternate for DNR is George Giesler. Amir from Transportation.
Good morning. Yeah, this is Amir Nizam, Technical Services Manager for the Washington State Department of Transportation Development Division. A little bit about our division. We are the largest division at the WashDOT headquarters. We include highway design policy, technical services, environmental services, the bridge office, hydraulics, and real estate services. And one of the groups under the technical services branch that I lead is utilities. And this is the office that establishes policies for authorizing utility infrastructure within highway rights of way, as well as how we coordinate with utilities during project design and construction. And so for this group, I will be a resource to inform what may or not be feasible as far as utilizing highway corridors for routing transmission facilities. And on a larger scale, sustainability is one of WashDOT's strong values, and it's included in our agency's vision. And so we're excited to participate in any efforts that enhance sustainability through focus on energy efficiency and pollution reduction. And I was also at UTC between 1999 and 2005. So I'm excited to see a couple of my former UTC colleagues I haven't seen in years, and otherwise glad to be here and look forward to these discussions.
Great, Amir, thank you. I'm going to come to Rick next, and then I'm going to come to the Association of Washington City Representatives. Rick, please. Rick Jackson, sorry, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Rick Jackson. I'm the Energy Manager for the Washington State Military Department. I also go by Bernard Jackson, so sorry for the confusion if the name is a little bit different. So National Guard is also one of our names. We are responsible for the protection of people, property, and the environment. For this reason, reliable access to power is very important to our mission as we make up the Emergency Management Division, Air Guard, State Guard, National Guard, Army Guard, as well as other state emergency response divisions. DOD and the Washington Military Department are invested in renewable energy and its implementation for the best practices to facilitate our efforts in being good stewards of the taxpayer dollars. And this is why we are interested in the TCWG working group, as this does pertain to our sites and our reliable access to power. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And do you prefer to go by Bernard or Rick?
Bernard would be great.
Okay, Bernard, thank you. Sorry about that. I called you Rick. I apologize about that. And so if I butcher anyone's pronunciation or name the first time, I apologize. If I do it the second time, then you can blame me. So, okay, I've got, next I'm going to go to the Association of Washington Cities and then the Washington State Association of Counties. Julie, do you mind introducing yourself next?
Sure, I'm Julie Kopic with the City of Ellensburg. We're a municipal electric utility. Our, I think, interest here is probably just being centrally located in the state and delivering low-cost, reliable electricity and energy sources to our customers here.
Great, thank you. Clint? Clint, I am not able to hear you right now, so I see you're unmuted on Zoom, so you might have a hardware mute.
How about that? Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear.
All right. Sorry about that. Name's Clint Whitney. I work for City of Richland. Like Ellensburg, the city is a small electric municipal, and we have. I'm involved in with the city with transmission planning as well as substation distribution asset planning. And one of our large interests right now is economic development. We've had significant growth as well as been and continue to be impacted by transmission planning and capacity constraints through at least 2025. And so it is hamstringing us for economic development, and I'm very interested in participating with this work group to further that along.
Great. Thank you, Clint, very much. Brandy DeLange is going to be the alternate in the instance that Julie or Clint are unable to make it. Next, I'm going to come to the Washington Association of Counties and then our PUD representative. So Kevin and then Lindsay. Kevin.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Kevin Schutte. I'm a Mason County Commissioner and representing the State Association of Counties on the work group. We're very much interested in helping fulfill the goals of the legislature when it comes to transmission and energy, and so that's a big priority for us, and very much at the local level interested in making sure that we have renewable energy sources to provide affordable power into the future. And address the continuing challenges that come along with growth and development. So excited to work with the group.
Kevin, thank you. I have got Lindsay next. Lindsay, please.
Lindsay Pollock from Lewis County and representing Washington State Association of Counties. For Lewis County, one of our big interests is the fact that we're at the intersection of Highway 12 and I-5. So in terms of north-south access and then east-west access over the Cascades, we are in a pretty strategic position for that. So we're anticipating that any discussions of transmission will probably be involving us fairly heavily. We're also fairly aware of the complex interplay between environmental and economic interests. And so, and having that experience, we think we can be helpful even for the rest of the state to look out for the interests of the counties. There's a perception that local government does not necessarily have a seat at the table on these discussions. So one of the goals here is to just make sure that that information gets back to the smaller government entities that yes, we are being heard.
Lindsay, thank you.
Thank you.
And the alternate for the Washington State Association of Counties is Paul Jewell. Next, I'm going to move to the PUD representative, and then I'm going to move to the representatives of sovereign tribal governments. Nicholas.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Nicholas Garcia on behalf of the Washington Public Utility Districts Association. By way of introduction, PUDs provide nearly 40% of the electricity that's delivered to retail customers in this state. So obviously, the ability to reliably deliver power is essential to our service. We were watched with dismay as the problems cropped up in Texas and in California in terms of having brownouts and those sorts of things. And so we're very excited about the work of this group. Hopefully we can get out ahead of those sorts of issues and make sure that that they don't manifest themselves here. So thank you.
Great. All right, I'm going next to Dana.
Good morning. My name is Dana Miller. I'm an elected member of Yakama Nation Tribal Council, and our interest is out to look out for the natural and cultural resources on the land and how it's going to impact the Yakama Nation ceded land and areas. My alternate is Jeremy Takala, and he's not logged on today. Thank you.
Thank you. We also have another representative from the Snoqualmie tribe, Stephen Mullen Moses. I received an email message from him this morning that he was having a family emergency. He wanted me to pass that along, that he regrets not being able to be here. I'm now going to move to the representative from Puget Sound Energy.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Lorna.
This is Lorna Luby, and I'm with Puget Sound Energy. And I would say in terms of our interest, we're the largest IOU in the state, providing electricity to 1.1 million customers in Washington. And with both our own clean energy goals and the CETA, the Clean Energy Transformation Act, as well as the push to electrify the transportation sector, you know, we're a utility looking at, because we're an investor-owned utility, we don't have the hydro resources a lot of the PUDs do. We have an over almost 60% thermal generation electric fleet right now that needs to be 80% carbon-free by 2030, 100% carbon-free by 2045, you know, plus any additional load from electrifying the transportation. So obviously, transmission is near and dear to our heart. We realize we're going to need, you know, a significant amount of transmission to pull off these goals. Yet we're also a local utility. And as others have echoed, you know, we need to thoughtfully site transmission and make sure it works for everybody. So that's kind of where we are.
Great. Lorna, thank you. Next, I'm going to be going to the representatives from statewide environmental organizations, Vlad and then Aaron. Vlad?
Hi, all. I'm Vlad. I'm the him. I'm the Washington State Director of Climate Solutions. We worked very hard for many years on passing CETA, and now it seems like for as many on trying to implement it with a lot of the agencies on the phone, and recognize the essential role that greater transmission plays toward its potential success. So hoping we can yield a good product here.
Great, thank you. Aaron?
Hi, I'm Erin Saylor. I'm a staff attorney with Columbia Riverkeeper. Riverkeeper works to reduce reliance on fossil fuels in the Columbia River Basin, and we want to ensure that the new energy infrastructure that we need in order to get renewable energy to folks is developed and constructed in an environmentally and cultural sensitive manner. And my alternate on the work group is Lauren Goldberg, who's not on today, but thank you.
Great. And then Katie Ware is an alternate to Vlad. So Katie, I'll ask that you quickly introduce yourself.
Thanks, Rob. Katie Ware, the Washington Policy Manager for Renewable Northwest. We're a regional nonprofit renewable energy advocacy organization, and we would like to ideally help responsibly minimize transmission-related barriers to meeting the state's clean energy standards. Thanks.
Okay, great, thank you. So that we have one other member, and I think I may have just let that person into the meeting. Is that the number that ends in 1655? Is that Allison Brooks? And if so, Allison, if you could unmute yourself and introduce yourself, that would be great. Okay, there's one member who was going to be joining by phone a little bit late. Her name is Allison Brooks, and she's with the Washington State Department of Architecture and Historical Preservation. So when she does join us, I'm going to make just a little bit of space for her to introduce ourselves. Couple of other quick introductions. The enabling legislation for the Transportation Corridor Working Group, TCWG, also names a couple of ex officio members. It calls for the Bonneville Power Administration and the U.S. Department of Defense. And so I'm going to ask representatives from those organizations to also introduce themselves. Anders, do you want to go first?
Hi, this is Anders Johnson from Bonneville Power Administration. I'm an electrical engineer in the long-term planning group. Bonneville is a federal power marketing administration that's part of the United States Department of Energy. We market the power from 31 federal hydro plants, the Columbia Generating Station nuclear plant, and several small non-power plants. We also operate a large transmission system in the Pacific Northwest. I'm interested in this work group because my group evaluates transmission service requests from customers, as well as performs scenario analysis, looking out at the regional needs for transmission over the next 10 to 20 years. And we're hoping that we can identify what's the right amount of transmission needed in the right places and at the right times.
Great, Anders, thank you. And the Bonneville Power alternate is Ravi Agarwal. Steve from U.S. Department of Defense.
Hey, good morning. Thank you so much. DoD greatly appreciate the invitation to participate in this working group. My name is Steve Chung, again, representing both Department of Defense and the Department of the Navy. Our primary interest and goals here in this early and proactive collaborative process, similar to other engagements DoD has had, within the state of Washington, our military operations, both on the testing and training platforms, covers a robust geographic area, both on land and.
Steve, it looks like you accidentally went on mute there. Do you want to quickly unmute yourself? Sorry about that. Don't know what happened.
That wasn't me. So with the robust footprints that the Department of Defense has within the state of Washington, any opportunities that enables early collaborative discussions to discuss, identify least conflict areas that could minimize military impacts to our equities. The Department of Defense are always in favor of that approach, and this working group definitely fits that bill. So again, appreciate the invitation. My alternate is unable to attend today. Her name is Computer. She is the boots on the ground for us up in the Northwest. I am headquarters down here in San Diego. So we look forward to the ongoing collaborative discussions and just looking to support this effort. Back to you. Over.
Great. Thank you, Steve. And then Allison, welcome. We're asking folks to introduce themselves very briefly. Allison.
Thank you. So I am Dr. Allison Brooks. I am the Historic Preservation Officer with the Department of Ecology and Historic Preservation. And actually today I'm attending a national meeting on tribal sacred sites for 2 days. So I'll be dropping back off of this meeting as soon as I'm done introducing myself. But my job is, along with the tribal representatives, to assist with the identification of archaeological, cultural, sacred, and historic places, and then work through the process of trying to avoid, minimize, or possibly mitigate harm to those sites. I would love to say I have a delegate, but because we have between 14,000 and 17,000 project reviews a year, I don't have any staff that can jump in and back me up because we are drowning in project reviews. So, but it's important. The work of this group is really important because the more that we can identify places of significance in advance, the better off we are in terms of being able to avoid impacts and effects. So thank you.
Allison, thank you for popping out of your other meeting and joining us. We appreciate it very much. Thank you.
So I'm going to pop back out and I will see you at the next meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, bye.
Great. Well, that concludes that part of the meeting and the introductions. I want to thank everybody for doing that. And again, if you forget who somebody is, we've worked to rename everyone in the Zoom to have their organizational affiliation. And you could also, if you could introduce yourself with your organizational affiliation when you speak for the first couple of meetings until we kind of get to know one another, that would also be very helpful. And then you also have as part of the meeting materials for today, very short biographies that folks were gracious to provide us. So Kathleen, I think we're done with the introductions. Anything else before we move on to the charter?
No, thank you. And thanks to everybody. This group does have a tremendous amount of both experience and interest, and I'm looking forward to learning from all of you. Rob.
Great. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the charter for this group. I'm going to take the screen sharing and we're going to just be working from the document. And so give me one moment here while I bring up my Word document here. If folks that have their video on could give me a thumbs up if they can see that. Excellent. And thumbs up if the size is okay, or thumbs down if you need it bigger. Okay, perfect. Okay, so I recognize that charter work is a little bit tedious, but it is also incredibly important because this charter codifies what our shared understanding of our work is. And so the way that I want to walk through this is I'm going to do this in two parts. I'm going to talk about the legislative charge, and we've got specific language in the charter about that. And I'm going to talk about the approach and the scope for how the work group is going to do that work. That's chunk one of the charter. Chunk two of the charter is a little bit more of the nitty gritty, talks about the ground rules, how we operate, how alternates work, and all of that stuff. But we're going to start with the purpose and the legislative charge. To do that, what I would like to do is I would like to focus on the specific language that's in the legislative charge. And I'm going to be asking you all as participants to ask any clarifications about assumptions, about terminology, about what's in and about what's out of scope. And then after we do that, we're going to jump into the approach, which describes how this work group is going to accomplish the stuff that is set out in the legislative charge. The first thing here is that is highlighted in a light blue here is really what I consider the purpose of this group, and it comes directly from the Clean Energy Transformation Act. Based on current technology, there will likely be a need to be upgrades to the electricity transmission and distribution infrastructure across the state to meet the goals specified in CETA. And these facilities require significant planning horizon to deliver electricity generation sites to retail electric load. And so because of that need statement, that purpose, the act calls for the creation of this work group to do the following. And so we're just going to march through these. I'm going to go to number one. I'm going to see if folks have any reflections on it, any clarifications about assumptions, terminology, or in and out of scope. So we're going to review the need for upgraded and new electricity transmission and distribution facilities to improve reliability, relieve congestion, and enhance the capability of the transmission and distribution facilities in the state to deliver electricity from electric generation, non-emitting electric generation, or renewable resources to retail electric load. There are two footnotes that describe how this charter assumes what the scope of the discussions are. So I encourage folks to reflect on that. So as Glenn has done, if you have any comments or thoughts on this, please raise your hand and I'll call on you and ask that you unmute and pop in. Glenn, thank you.
Sure, thank you. I wanted to comment on the footnote 2. In this law, the non-emitting generation is specifically defined to exclude renewable generation. So, you know, I think kind of in common usage, we would think of renewables as being one form of non-emitting. But in this law, that term is used in a pretty narrow way, which is electric generation that is not renewable and does not emit greenhouse gases in the production of electricity. So I would delete that footnote or pick up the definition in CETA, non-emitting.
Great, we will definitely make that change. Thank you, Glenn. Okay, other thoughts about this charge, this specific number one there, this specific responsibility of this group? Yeah, Nicholas, please.
So I am not certain whether this should be part of number 1 or number 2, but it does strike me that identifying some sense of the necessary timing for the new electricity transmission distribution facilities would be important. Because it's one thing to say you need them, but if it's not needed for 25 years, that's a different urgency than if it's needed 5 years from now.
Okay, great. So Nicholas, I'll specifically ask that question when we come down when we actually talk about what the actual work is to compile and to answer this question. So I've made a note here, Nicholas, and I promise I'll get to it. Okay. Other thoughts here on number one? Any clarifications, assumptions you're making about here that you want to share with the group? And again, Alt-Y to raise your hand, or if there's no cue, just feel free to unmute yourself and jump in. Okay, so number two, yeah, Glenn, please, yeah.
And this is Glenn again. I promise I won't talk this much through the whole thing, but I just want to say that on footnote 1, I don't actually know about this distinction between what is a transmission line and what's a distribution line. Some of our utility members, if they vouch for this, then I would gladly accept it. But it makes me a little nervous to so early in the document and in our work make a definition like that, draw a line. So I just want to be careful about doing that.
Glenn, thank you for voicing that. Does anyone have any reflections on that? And again, this is the exact purpose of this discussion, so that we don't get to meeting 5 and we're all carrying around a slightly different version of what the scope is. Any reflections on what Glenn said there?
I would agree with Glenn. I would defer to maybe, maybe Anders has some input on that delineation.
Anders, do you have any thoughts on that? And since Joe told me to do it, I just want to know it's not the facilitator's decision to call you out. It's Joe's decision to call you out. So Anders, just kidding, Anders, I'm doing it. I'll take responsibility. Okay. And we can circle back. Any other thoughts there on kind of how we are defining how we're defining transmission and distribution facilities?
Oh, hi. Sorry, this is Anders. I think I was muted. I was double muted.
Yep, Anders, and then yes, we can hear you. And then Dana, I will come to you. Anders.
So one definition we could use for reference would be the bulk electric system definition from NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. That could be a guideline. I think that's around 100 kV and above generally.
Okay. Dana?
And number 3, can we add the cultural resources in there someplace?
Yeah, and how would you see that, Dana, kind of fitting in? So that would be like how the cultural resources are integrated into those specific environmental review options.
Yes, and the NEPA review.
Great. Thank you, Dana. Julie.
I was just going to suggest on footnote 2 well, it says this includes power, but maybe just to further clarify, but not limited to, just in case other things come up, just to be clear that we're not limiting it to those items.
Great. Thank you, Julie. Okay. Other thoughts here on clarifications or questions regarding the legislative language?
Sorry, this is behind. I just was going to add in with Anders' comment. This is Lorna Luby from PSC that our our smallest transmission is generally 115 kV. So I think the NERC definition is a good one to go with.
Great. Great. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to go to the next section of the charter where we take the outcome that's described in the legislative charge and we describe what the work is going to look like for the work group. I've already got some comments from folks that sent them in before the meeting, and that's what's captured in the existing comments here. So what I wanted to do is I did want to go through these one by one. And so outcome number one from the group, and again, this is taken directly from the legislative charge, is to review the need for upgraded and new electricity transmission and distribution facilities. So what we're saying here in this charter, the way that the Transportation Corridor Working Group does that is first, we're going to get a baseline understanding of the state of transmission and the transmission siting process in Washington. And so that's the presentation you're going to be getting today. We're going to receive a briefing on the portion of the Washington State Energy Strategy. So that is also articulating what a need is. In meetings 2 and 3, we're going to be reaching out to members of this group to learn about other relevant energy strategies, and that all of those presentations are going to be part of that documentation of what the need is. And then using this baseline knowledge, that the Transportation Corridor Working Group, the conversation we're going to have as a group is to discuss potential gaps to support those future energy strategies, and things like location of resources versus loads, and other important attributes. Glenn Blackman from Commerce also suggested that we could look at, and so I'm proposing that we add to this the backlog of interconnections requests as also a description of what need looks like. And so here what I'm looking for is, does the work that we describe here, getting presentations and understanding what needs are, and then looking at gaps, does that feel like the right work to fulfill that outcome, to review the need for upgraded and new electricity transmission and distribution facilities? And so Julie, I saw that you had your hand up. I don't know if you had a comment that had to do with something else, but I see you have it down now. So Julie, I'll make space for you now if you have a comment. And then I want to open it up to folks to reflect on how we've described this work for the group.
I had just forgotten to lower it from before, so I'm good.
Okay, legacy hand raise.
Correct.
Yeah, Nicholas, please.
So this relates to the same sort of issue I brought up before. The need for new transmission is an evolving need, and it will change over time as various requirements of this state and others start really taking effect. And so I do think we have to kind of understand the need as in what time frame. So are we talking 2035, 2045, or some other date, or perhaps we're talking about a need over the next 20 years, thinking about it as a continuum. I'm not sure, and I would imagine that Glenn Blackman could talk a little bit about the state energy strategy in terms of the date that that strategy was assessing need. But whatever we decide, I don't really have an opinion on it, but whatever we decide, I think we have to clarify what the goal in terms of a temporal aspect is. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Nicholas. And so I've got Vlad, and then I'm going to ask folks to reflect on this. What do folks want to do with regard to the timing, Vlad?
Yeah, thanks. I think I have two thoughts on sort of Nicholas's broad question. One is, I think it makes sense to think about CETA and its two phases. Potential transmission needs to help Washington achieve the 2030 target versus the 2045 target. Those are the kind of two chunks of expectations. And there's the coal phase out, but that's sort of to some extent indifferentiable from 2030 in terms of resources and acquisition. So thinking about what the resource needs associated with achieving both those targets are. I think the other thing that might be useful is, in addition to the sort of state analysis and regional analysis on transmission needs, is if there are utilities that are planning their system that are looking at potential transmission needs. A regional analysis is going to show one thing, but because we have a lot of balancing authorities and sort of a balkanized grid in the Northwest, the transmission needs may show up differently if you look at it, at less than a regional footprint. So Puget, for example, has over the years talked about a specific transmission need that would come much sooner than maybe what the region might otherwise show. So if there are a few large utilities like that, or large entities that are going to develop substantial resources, asking them what their particular transmission needs might be and on what timeline might be helpful for this purpose.
Great, thank you for that. And I'm going to put Kathleen and Joe and Stu on the spot here. I want to make sure that I understand. I think that is what your intent was when you talked about asking other parties that are on this group to present their vision and their needs as part of the next meeting to get at exactly what Vlad talked about there.
Absolutely, and that's a good suggestion. So we very much want to hear, and there may be very different perspectives on energy strategy in the future, and we want that all to be included in the beginning stages of our work group, so we understand the perspectives, and that helps us with our findings and recommendations to put together. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kathleen. Any other reflections on timing? Does it make sense? And maybe I can. I'm gonna direct this question at everybody, and then I'm gonna call it Nicholas and Glenn. Does it make sense to think about being explicit about the timing to be the 2030 target and the 2045 target? So I'm going to see folks have general comments, reflections on that, and then Nicholas and Glenn, I'll see if you guys have any reflections about specifically. Yeah, Julie, please.
I'm just going to echo Nicholas's comment about the need to have some sort of timing in here, just from the perspective of other meetings we get involved in and see the implications with resource adequacy. That's going to end up driving a lot of the timing requirements as well. It's not just the CETA targets, it's when do we start running into issues as our reliable sources of energy come offline and everybody maintains their distribution and transmission systems. Benton PUD is already one that's unsure of their future and looking for resources.
Great, thank you, Julie. Anders, please. And then after Anders, I'll come to Nicholas and Glenn, see if you have thoughts. Anders?
Yeah, I think looking around the 2030 milestone certainly makes sense. The transmission reliability analysis usually looks out to about as far out as about 10 years in a fairly granular fashion. But I think it also makes sense to look, further out at the longer term targets, but maybe you do that from a little higher level perspective, or with acknowledgement that there may be greater uncertainties around the technology availability and some of the other considerations.
Okay, great. Glenn, any thoughts on timing here?
Yeah, thanks. I definitely agree with Nicholas's point that we need to incorporate the time dimension into this, and that as we go through this, we need to be thinking about, both what do we need and when do we need it. But I don't think it reduces to anything real simple or specific right now. One reason for that is that we need to be looking at reliability and congestion as things that might drive the need for transmission upgrades, and those are probably immediate type considerations. But then also the extent to which we need transmission upgrades to support our transition to clean energy, it's just so complicated. Like to meet the 2030 standard, we'll need resources that, would come online then or before then. And it's like a continual process of, needing to grow the transmission system. And when I do the presentation on the energy strategy, I can show you some information then about the kind of the timing of resource needs. But I guess I feel like if we could, reflect this time dimension to the problem without getting too specific about particular timeframes, we might be better off later.
Nicholas?
I'm in this position of agreeing completely with Vlad and Glenn and Anders. The challenge is that there's so much we don't know and we can't know today. What sort of public policies are going to evolve and what sort of adoption rates will happen, and even how strong the economy will be 3 to 6 to 10 years from now. All those will affect the need for electricity, which in turn affects the need for transmission. So I don't think that it makes sense to have a hard date on January 1st, 2030. This is what we need, because that's just, we don't have that level of knowledge and specificity. But I would agree that having general targets around general timeframes adds us an understanding of what do we need to start working on now versus what do we can wait for a few years. And some things we'll probably need to be starting working on yesterday. Congestion and system reliability, we're beginning to run into those issues and concerns already. And so, it doesn't necessarily mean that we don't want to think about what we need now. But I guess I would argue just that we have to keep the temporal impact or the temporal timing in the back of our minds as we're moving forward with this, because it does provide an understanding of what needs to be done sooner versus later. So hopefully that helps.
That does. My key takeaway here, so how I'm hearing this conversation evolve is a recognition that we need to be explicit about the assumptions and the uncertainty when we talk about timeframes, but we are not going to be necessarily organizing everything around timeframes. So we have to be cognizant about it and then document what the assumptions and uncertainty are. But it's not going to be the primary driver with regard to how we organize our work. Give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down for those that are on video if that's what you're hearing as well. Or turn your video off if you don't want to be on the record. I'm just kidding. Can't do that. All right, Nicholas, I see a thumbs up. Lauren, I see a thumbs up. Folks that aren't putting their thumbs up, why aren't you putting your thumbs up? Are you hearing it different? Thank you, Kevin.
I'm not technically savvy and need to figure out my thumbs up mechanism.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so let me kind of very quickly review the bidding, the changes that I'm seeing to the charter before we move on. I meant do this up above here. So we're going to update the, we're going to, as part of the purpose and legislative charge section, we're going to update the footnotes to clarify the definition of non-emitting electric generation consistent with what Glenn and Julie suggested. And then we're going to upgrade the definition of transmission distribution facilities to be consistent with the bulk generation definitions for NERC. What I'm hearing for number 2 here is that we need to be more explicit about what we mean when we say learn about other relevant energy strategies, be specific about the types of things we expect to be hearing, such as utility planning and from the notes, I don't remember off the top of my head what the other suggestions are. And then we're going to add a sentence here about how timing is going to be dealt with, that we're going to be documenting assumptions and uncertainty when we discuss timeframes, because we recognize that timeframes are important, but the level of certainty increases as we hit some of the further out years. I want to move to section 2 here. Because section 2 is really the intersection point of what folks have been talking about. This is the place where timing intersects with the for what. And so outcome number 2 is specifically says in the legislation to identify areas where transmission and distribution facilities may need to be enhanced or constructed. I want to talk about the word pathways in here because I think pathways is a word that may not be the appropriate word here, but what I want to tell you is what we mean by pathways in here. We recognize that when Kathleen, Joe, Stu, and us got together to talk about this group, we recognize that for this group to be successful, we couldn't talk in the abstract and theoretical all the time. Because that would not allow us to identify areas where transmission and distribution facilities are. So in our mind, pathways is trying to organize the conversation in chunkable ways on the real life issues we expect to see based on where the power is or most likely going to come from and the shape of the transmission system. And so when we first thought about this work, we thought, oh, perhaps we could chunk up the conversation around, increased in-state wind and solar, the stuff that we have in the IE here. Some feedback that we got is that maybe that didn't make as much sense, and that perhaps we could look at the way that the BPA has been thinking about main categories of upgrades. And so that's what I have here in my second comment, that instead of the pathways that we have described here in the charter, that perhaps the chunkable way that we could begin thinking about timing, thinking about implications impact on cultural resources, impact on cities, impact on all the things that we know are important to talk about, instead of thinking about them this way, that we think about them as part of the main category of upgrades that BPA has identified. And so I am looking for some feedback for the group. How can we make this chunkable so that we can accomplish the work that we're charged with, which is identify areas where transmission and distribution facilities may need to be enhanced or constructed. So Joe, is there anything that you want to add, or Kathleen or Stu, with regard to specific feedback you want from the group?
About that, looking for the mute button. No, I think that covers it. We really are looking for any guidance folks may have on a way to organize this conversation. And I think that a recent conversation I had with Anders, I'd be really interested to hear from Lorna as well about an approach to this. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Kathleen?
And again, we started looking at this as probably more from the perspective of what FSEC's role is, right? You look first from kind of your navel out, right? And we cite specific facilities. So that's in one way why the specific kind of facilities pathway made sense to us. But what we really want is for it to make sense to the group in a way we can get our hands around it and be able to talk, not as Rob said, not just theoretically. We're not going to get down to the project level, and we want to actually not get down to the project level, but we do want to be able to organize in such a way that makes sense to how we might be able to give the best path forward at the end of the paths, because there are going to be multiple paths at the end of this project.
Thank you, Kathleen. So I've got Anders and Vlad. Anders?
Yeah, I had some thoughts for how to organize the different types of projects based on the different purposes that I was planning to get into in the presentation later in the afternoon, but it might be a bit of a longer discussion.
Okay, great. Vlad?
I'm sorry, you were saying that you want to use BPA's projections of where resources would be necessary as part of their planning. Is that what you were suggesting?
Yeah, potentially. And Vlad, we're kind of open. So the thing that we're seeking here is that we recognize that to have the conversation that has potential different, different scenarios. Again, we don't want to use the word different scenarios, but there's different combinations of things that could happen down the line. We're trying to figure out how to best chunk the conversation so that we don't talk ourselves in circles.
I think BPA might be a good input. I do think that we should try and think a little bit more broadly than what BPA or any one utility might be projecting, because as Nicholas has sort of identified, part of what's going to drive demand for transmission and clean energy will be carbon obligations and a variety of other things that happen. And so looking at the kind of transmission that might be necessary in a deeply decarbonized economy could be different than what any utility planning system, any utility planning process projects as necessary now. So I don't, Glenn, did Energy Evolve Research, does their RIO model like plot out? I know E3's Resolve model does, but like potential resources and where they're located associated with the core scenario that you guys advanced. I mean, is that a resource to look at potentially? Oh, well, we're expecting a bunch of wind resources potentially to be installed in X location, and so we may need extra transmission to bring it over. Like just something that looks at a more ambitious electricity load future than what a utility planning process may yield as an input as well.
Glenn, yeah, and then I'll come to Lorna. Glenn?
Okay, there's some information in the state energy strategy and the modeling that I'll go over later. It's not as granular as one might imagine. It tends to be in kind of broad terms, like how much wind from the Rockies seem to be part of the preferred portfolio. And there's also, the strategy could be fulfilled with different combinations of resources, so that in-state solar is, a close substitute for out-of-state wind, for example. So I wouldn't, I'd be hesitant to treat the results of the energy strategy as definitive on a point like this, because it is more detailed than kind of the level that we were working at in the energy strategy.
I agree that it shouldn't be definitive. I just do worry about planning or trying to do this work around too limited of a view of what the demand that might materialize over time is or might be, and so it might be useful to do something that uses, for example, something like BPA as a baseline, but then looks at a more at what capacity needs might be in a more ambitious scenario. So, to sort of bookend it somewhat or something like that. I just worry that we shouldn't just look at something that doesn't incorporate, for example, deep electrification as a potential demand for source of demand for new transmission, which I'm not sure, for example, that BPA is doing, because that's not what they're supposed to be doing.
And I share that concern, but anyway, I should let the moderator get back in control of the meeting here.
We're in wonderful control. This is the exact conversation we were hoping to have. So I'm deeply appreciative of the folks contributing to it. So I've got Lorna, Stu, then Anders. Lorna?
Yeah, I don't really have much to add other than to echo Anders' comments and Glenn's comments. I think considering the requirements under CETA, and I know when I've talked, well, I should clarify, I'm a siting person, I'm not a transmission person. I'm happy, I think it's a great idea to have folks on here talking about, I could get someone from Puget specifically talking about what we're looking at, but I just was going to comment that the BPA system is already crosses the Cascade. So when we look, we know we need a bunch of renewables in the West. And as Glenn pointed out too, it's also going to depend on cost, right? It's Montana wind, Wyoming wind, Idaho wind, but yeah, maybe if there's solar closer, it's all going to depend on what are the least cost renewables that are the most accessible. So when we start to look at it, the first thing we do is look at the BPA map of what's there now, and then what can be upgraded. So I think BPA is a great starting point. And like I said, I think I agree with the comments that this is going to be somewhat dynamic.
Lorna, thank you. I've got Stu, then Anders. Stu, please.
Yeah, in response to for Vlad, I think it should be, we want to be clear. We're not suggesting that we take any particular analysis or numbers that are coming out of BPA. We're really just looking at that categorization on the in the note there on the screen of really, number one, how do you get, there's getting from the generator to the lines. There's getting the lines across, there's getting the energy across the Cascades, there's getting up and down I-5, and there's getting it from out of state. So it's really just that dividing of the places to look, and possibly with the offshore. So we're not asking to take anybody's projections about where it's going to come. We're saying that these are kind of the main, these are the places, however much it has to come, these are the places it's got to come, and this is the pathways it's got to, the routes it's got to travel. That's just a way of thinking about it.
And this is Joe. I would just quickly add to that we are where the focus is on the transmission implications of each of these pathways. Really, that's the focus. So I just want to make that clear.
Thank you, Joe. I've got Anders, then Dana. Anders, please.
Okay, just a couple of things. One was that an approach we could use would be to start with how much of the attributes we think we'll need, such as energy and capacity and maybe flexibility, and then kind of work from there to see what are some ways that those requirements could be met. And then a second point would be just to clarify BPA's role, that we're an open access transmission provider. So we don't pick which resources that our customers are going to build, but they come to us with requests for service, and then we identify what if long-term firm service would be available, or conditional firm, or if upgrades would be required to give what they would be requested. So I think it's ultimately going to be kind of an iterative process between the transmission providers, the developers, the load-serving entities, and other stakeholders.
Great, Anders, thank you. Dana.
Yeah, what needs to be added in this number 2 section is consultation with tribes for the pathways of these proposed energy projects.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you, Dana. Okay. Other thoughts on how we organize our work here on this one? Okay, so this is what I'm hearing, and I'm going to see if this is reflective of what folks are hearing. What I heard is that partly because I said this first part, that it's really important that we be specific about how we're going to enter into the conversation, is that the framework that we're going to use is the baseline framework of the kinds of upgrades that we think we may need to make to support the energy vision we identify number 1. And so that's getting new in-state generation to the to the system, getting that power to the load center, I-5 corridor improvements, and then out-of-state lines for import or export. So those are the types of potential transmission system upgrades we could make. And then we need to intersect that with the stuff that Glenn and Vlad and others recognize are important, which is the question of what is it that we're going to do with these upgrades, and therefore what is the implication for what the existing system looks like. So that is what, to me, the work is of number 2. When we say identify areas where transmission and distribution facilities may need to be enhanced or constructed, the report is going to say for the following kinds of visions that we're interested in, to get new in-state generation, as we have here to the main grid, these are the following things that we're going to, these are the following things that we talked about. These are the kinds of upgrades we think we're going to need to make to do that. To support the vision and the need that we described, this is what we're going to need to do to make sure that that gets to the load center. These are the things that we think we're going to need to do for I-5 corridor improvements. That these category of upgrades are the scaffolding by which we then hang the changes and the recommendations and the for enhancements or construction to support the vision that that we outline in number 1. So that's what I'm hearing. I want to make sure that that is consistent with your thinking, and I want to make sure that you think that that would then be satisfactory of that outcome number 2. Kathleen?
Thank you. One thing I do want to make sure doesn't get lost in this conversation is that we are talking about the connection between additionally built generation and transmission, but there are different types of futures that I don't think have been fully defined yet, and that would be a distributed energy future and how much of the load a distributed energy future would include, which is maybe perhaps a quite different transmission issue than building new generation facilities that have larger amounts of energy to transmit longer distances. So I want to make sure we don't lose that part of that pathway as we talk about this. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Kathleen. I'm going to go Ben from Fish and Wildlife, and then Stu and Anders. I don't know if you have residual hands up, or if you do want me to call and you leave your hands up there. If not, if you could put them down. So I've got Ben, then Clint. Ben?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first, Rob, I do think the way that you outlined it, I think that does make sense to me. And then I was thinking that outcome number 2 would be a good place to include something on sort of acknowledging that in addition to locational geographic implications, that we should consider species and habitat as part of that. It seems like that would be a good place for that.
Yeah. Thank you, Ben. Clint?
Thanks.
I think I heard a little bit of it from Kathleen and Lorna, but when I think an upgrade here, and I'm looking through the list and trying to think globally on this, but these pathways, a lot of these pathways are already defined and can be upgraded just by upgrading the voltage of the transmission line. So it's not just new pathways need to be defined and the upgrades. What's missing, I think, in this is potentially upgrading of the transmission line to get that capacity.
For folks who know more about the transmission line than I know at this point, is what Clint said included in what kind of I outlined as the approach, like in these main category of upgrades?
This is Stuart. I think that was what we had all in mind. It's upgrading is not necessarily building new lines. It could be increasing the voltage of the design of the lines to increase the voltage, things like that. We weren't trying to take a stand on that.
Great, thank you, Stu. Lorna?
And just really a question. I don't want to be too presumptuous, but I guess the pragmatic view, when I said earlier, when we look at a map and what's available, right, is what are the existing corridors that are already established? And then I think if you need to go beyond the existing corridors that are established, I think you absolutely have to look at existing transportation corridors. I mean, so I don't know if it's worth limiting, because I think the idea of building a brand new corridor that isn't even an existing transportation corridor, just, oh my goodness, that brings in so many things. So.
Great. Thank you, Lorna. Okay, other thoughts on this one?
I had one more thought, and my hand raising button doesn't seem to be working. That's
by design, Joe. That's by design. No, I'm just kidding, Joe. Joe, and then Julie.
So I was going to talk about, Anders and I had talked about this idea of, when we're talking about utilizing existing transmission infrastructure, we also need to talk at some point about transmission service requests and the fact that there are this sort of reserved capacity on existing transmission lines, large amounts of it that are not being used. And I think that at some point we need to address that.
Great, thank you. Julie.
I was just going to ask, we're kind of talking domestically with some of these pathways. Can we look at Canada, our neighbor to the north?
Kathleen, Joe, or Stu, how what's your take on that, and how should that be incorporated, Kathleen?
So I do think we have to think about the impacts of importing energy from other places, which could include Canada. I mean, we talk about Montana wind, but there already is BC, Washington, California. It would be more what's the impact within our state from that. So I don't think that's off the table, but I think that's more of a what would we see coming from that, rather than delving deeply into it, but specifically what would be the impact then on the transmission in the state. So if that's your question, I think that that would be in the same category of importing from other places. It just would have a different impact, obviously, on the transmission system if it came from Canada rather than Montana.
Julie, does that make sense?
Yeah, I just didn't want to be kind of narrow focused, that we're just kind of looking east and west, but we look north as well.
Thank you. And south, because the fact is we do import from California as much, well, not as much, but as we also export to California. And
I think we'll see in Glenn's presentation later some generalized maps of planned increases of imported power from the north and also from solar from the south. So I think we'll see a little bit of that later.
Great. I've got Nicholas, please.
So this is more of a question than a comment, but several people have kind of noted that there are different alternatives that might become available. And a few years ago, BPA was looking at putting in a major new power line between Portland and I think Centralia. And they decided to pursue a non-wires option because of the how incredibly expensive the new line would be. So this leads to my question: are we going to be thinking about, sort of the host of options available rather than just lines? And the second question is, even if we determine you just can't do these other things, they're just not enough capacity that they'll unlock. Do we think about cost? I mean, is that going to be part of our mission? I just don't know. But just to remind everyone, we're talking billions of dollars. This is a huge expense.
Mm-hmm. Kathleen, do you have any reflections on both those questions? How we accommodate physical, I don't know what the right terminology is, but what Nicholas described there, and then the cost question.
I don't have I hear you and know that's, and that's one of the biggest challenges is we really don't know what the future will bring us in solutions, because this is a problem that's going to be faced everywhere around the world. And so we do have more and more either technological or other types of solutions. So I think we need to be open it, but we also have to figure out a way to define and get to some findings within, and maybe that's where we go back to what, and hearing from those who are closest to developing those solutions, what percentage of the issue that, maybe that's what we do, what percentage of the issue that those non-wire solutions might be able to address, and in what general locations, because we've got to get this to some sort of manageable issue that we can get our arms around in order to get findings and recommendations. So I think I would look to presentation. I don't want to leave it closed out, but I would look to the presentations and then maybe coming back to the issue as we go forward.
Mm-hmm. And Kathleen, what about the question of resources? Before you answer that question, I'll just say that yeah, I'll just say that that the reason it does not show up on the charter is because it did not show up as a request from the governor or the legislature in the act. And so we try to be extremely mindful that our scope be consistent with what is described in the mandate for this group.
Yes, and I think that's true, and it could be a footnote because we don't have the resources, frankly, for this group to be able to cost out alternatives. That isn't the way this has been set up. So that may be a caveat that we put in, that others need to look at those the findings and recommendations. That could be one of the findings, is that these need to be compared by cost.
And just, this is Stuart, Stuart Henderson, just to piggyback on that. I think our assumption was always that costs, we aren't studying all the costs, but as part of our input, we wanted to learn about costs of various alternatives. Our assumption was always that's part of coming up with a good plan that we're going to be, or good thoughts that we're going to be recommending. We don't have we're not proposing to, create a unlimited budget to do any of this. But we want to understand what the options are.
Great. Thank you, Stu. Anders?
Yeah, just in response to that question about the non-wire solutions and that the Castle Rock Troutdale project that BPA had proposed several years ago and went through some permitting and then ultimately elected not to build the project, that some of those measures can include contracting with loads or with the generators to manage their output for a short amount of time, and this can be more effective if you have a congestion problem or a reliability problem that's a real limited number of hours of the year, but it might be less suitable if you have a problem that's more frequent throughout the year that you're trying to manage. And the one we were trying to deal with was sort of concentrated in the summer afternoons and evenings on the hot days.
Great. Thank you, Anders. Okay, so what we're going to do here is I'm going to very quickly kind of review the bidding here on number 2, and then we're going to move on to number 3 and number 4. Those should go a little bit quicker. And then we'll take a very quick break after we get through 3 and 4 here. Let folks bio break or whatever we need to do, and then we'll come back and talk about the rest of the charter. So for number 2 here, I'm hearing 4 major changes. The first is that we want to be clear that the way that we're going to go about this work is going to be to identify the types of upgrades, and the intersection with those types of upgrades are going to be reflective of those visions and those needs. And that intersection point needs to be reflective of some of the things that we just talked about here, that to the extent that there are assumptions that we're making with regard to timing or to cost or to solution, that it needs to be documented as part of that. And then, there are things like species and habitat or capacity, reserve capacity having to do with the system that we're going to bring into that conversation as necessary. And so the changes that you're going to see here are going to be primarily in the description in the second or the third sentence to kind of reflect that approach of categories of upgrade intersection with need. So outcome number 3 here is like,
sorry, Rob, can I just ask a quick question? Sorry, this is Lorna, not to beat a dead horse, but
Lorna, please.
Do we want something on here to just acknowledge that we're going to focus on existing corridors first, and then maybe existing transportation corridors second? Because that would cover rail, highway. Yeah. So just to make it clear, because I think we just want to be thoughtful about just the that's what I tried to say earlier. Just saying a new corridors is just such a Pandora's box. So I think we have a lot of transmission corridors in the state already. Sorry, transmission, but also transportation corridors.
So I appreciate that, Lorna. I also want to make sure, we do have DOT with us, and I want to know if their DOT needs to have more conversation before we put that into the charter. It would be respectful.
No, that's totally fine. And I was, by transportation, I was also thinking of rail as well. So, but no, I hear you. I just was thinking pragmatically, where is there already, something built, whether it's, a road or rail?
I totally agree with the sentiment. So I appreciate you raising it.
Yeah, hi, this is Amir Nizam with WashDOT. I think that if the intent is to explore those opportunities, it's fine. But to it just matters how we would word it, so our intent is clear as all.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we'll work with you with that on that then.
Sounds good, thank you.
Add to Dana's request there, can we add and associate? Sorry, I'll wait.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Give me 1 second here just to make sure my fingers catch up. Yes, Joe, go ahead.
Just add and early consultation and associated transmission to Dana's request about early notification of tribes.
Yep. Yep, got it. Thank you, Joe. Okay, so number 3 here is like a wonderful walk on the beach or a cool drink of water compared to the one above. Outcome number 3, when we thought about it, is pretty straightforward. So the outcome is identify environmental review options and recommendations on ways to expedite the reviews. So in our mind, the way this work would happen is leading up to meeting number 4, as we thought about phasing, is the contracting team would compile the known and proposed environmental review options, so that isn't work that we had to do collectively, so that then the transportation corridor working group can then focus on for each environmental review option, identifying and describing key challenges, key considerations, and then trade-offs should the transmission facility trigger that environmental review option. So then we can then talk about how to expedite environmental reviews. And as Dana suggested, we will add cultural review as an explicit part of this. And so I want to see folks have any, if this makes sense to folks with regard to approach, and then any reflections on kind of this outcome and how we do that work. Yeah, Brendan.
I mean, it might help people to understand what we're talking about when we mean environmental review, and I interpret that to mean the full suite of, from SEPA, NEPA review through the other regulatory processes, the various environmental permitting.
Oh,
and so the SEPA frame on what the environment that's being considered is there's both the natural environment and then also the built environment or the human environment. So when we look at the built environment, then we're looking at things like cultural resources, transportation, and other things that you might not consider as environment. So just being clear on what we're covering here.
I think it would be good to put a footnote on that, Brendan, and we can work with you perhaps on that footnote to make sure that's explicit. I appreciate that. Yes, that's the intent.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Brendan. Other thoughts on this one? Okay, this one felt straightforward to us as well. Okay, so outcome number 4 is report and report development. I'm going to describe what this looks like and what the report vision is here, see where we're at, and then we'll take a break. I can see for the folks that are on the video that I'm seeing a little squirming. I'm feeling a little squirmy myself, so we might need a little bit of a break here. So as we read the charge to the group, we read that there are going to be 2 kinds of things that go in the report. The first is going to be a lot of the materials that we, as the contracting team working with FSEC, are pulling together for the meeting, so you all can discuss it. That raw material, those inputs to the meeting are going to comprise a bulk of the report, because those are going to be the places where we are answering some of the baselining and level setting questions that are in the charge. What are the needs? Well, the needs are going to be a reflection of the PowerPoint presentations and the materials we pull together to present to this group. What are the environmental review options? That's going to be, a set of materials that we pull together for this group to discuss. That is also going to go into the final report. The other, and maybe most interesting from our perspective, part of the report is then going to be the documentation and the conversations that you all have as a group regarding the materials that we bring forth to the group. So when we bring the environmental review options, that's going to go into the report, but what's also going to go into the report is the reflections you have on ways to expedite it, on what the pathways look like. So we intend to basically write the report as we go along. So the content of the report will come directly from the materials presented to the group, and then the summarized conversations of the group, and we will be drafting it through the process. And so what you can expect is that after each meeting, as we pull together the summarization from the meeting, and we're going to be asking you to provide comment and feedback on that. We're asking you to provide comment and feedback on that because we intend that write-up from the meeting and your reflections on those materials are going to become key components of the report itself. And because we only have 6 meetings of this group, we recognize that we don't have an endless time to do redlining and to do group writing for the report. So, if there are places where this group might have diverging opinions or divergent thoughts about, that's the kind of stuff that we're going to want to capture as part of the summaries from these meetings. And then that's going to be carried into the report. So it would say something like the Transportation Corridor Working Group had different perspectives on, this pathway or this, on this option, and here's what we had talked about. And in the places where it seems like most of you were there, we'll say things like most of the Transportation Corridor Working Group members agreed with this need assessment, or, or whatever that looked like. And that Kathleen, at the conclusion of this effort, would be the one that had the final pen on content of the report. So Kathleen, I want to make sure that I characterize that the way your understanding is of it, and then I want to see what folks think, and then we'll take a quick break. Okay, she gave me a thumbs up. So I'm going to see what folks think about that. It's trying to recognize that we don't have a lot of time in the meeting. And it's also trying to make sure that the report is reflective and empowering of your voices. Yeah, Nicholas, please.
So just to make sure I understand, if there is not consensus, if there's a minority opinion, will that be included in the final report?
Yes, we will try to capture that as part of the summary. And so Nicholas, and so what that means though is that if we don't, if you don't feel as if we summarize kind of and capture the essence of the conversation, and you're a part of the minority, you're a part of the majority, it's incumbent upon work group members to speak up in between meetings, because we're not going to wait till the end and have people review all 6 summaries of those meetings. And that's part of the expectations that we're going to talk about. Nicholas, does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you for the question. Other thoughts on this? Okay, I just want to thank folks. That was an incredible conversation. Thank you. And so what I want to do is I want to take a 5-minute break. We're going to come back right at 11 o'clock. And then we've got hopefully the balance of this charter discussion is not going to feel quite as onerous. So take a 5-minute break, come back at 11, and then we'll jump through the rest of this and then take our break. So thank you, everyone. Talk to you in 5 minutes. It's a 2-minute warning, everybody. We are going to be getting back here in 2 minutes. Okay, I'll ask that folks please find their way back to their computers. That felt like it was a fast 5 minutes, but it was actually 6 minutes. So just saying. So folks wouldn't mind flipping your video on to let me know that you're back. You can turn it back off if you want again, but I just want to know that I at least have some critical mass. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Stu, Kevin, Julie, Aaron. Welcome back, everybody. Okay, so we are going to pick up right where we left off. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to go over what are in essence the ground rules of the group. We're going to talk about explicit roles for the chair of this group, Kathleen. We're going to talk about attendance and alternates. We're going to talk about transparency and documentation. The conversation for each of these sessions is twofold. The first is, does it make sense? Any clarifications, any modifications that folks want to see made to the charter? And then is anything missing? And so I'm going to go through each of these sections. I'll stop for those kinds of reflections, and then we'll move on to the next section. So for operations, I already mentioned this at the outset. Participation during these meetings are limited to members, experts, guests, staff invited, and member alternates. And so we are not going to be engaging the public during the deliberations of this group. We will have specific time for public to engage during the public engagement sections. The charter assumes that the members are represented the perspective of their agencies. I mentioned this in reflection to Nicholas's question earlier, that meeting summaries will in general not attribute comments unless there is an explicit direction to do so. Number 4 there, and we fell short on this as the facilitation team, members should come prepared to participate in deliberations, and we're making a commitment to having materials available no later than 1 week prior to the meeting. And so I'm just saying that since this charter wasn't codified beforehand, it didn't apply to this meeting. No, I'm just kidding. I'm sorry we didn't get the meeting materials in advance, and we will do better. We may ask that you work with one another in between meetings. We're not going to have a quorum or consensus requirement